Hi, this is Chris Young, and welcome to Good News on Tap for the 30th Sunday of Ordinary Time. One of my all-time heroes is a man named Jim Pauley, who was a longtime advocate for the disabled here in Indianapolis. He founded the local chapter of the Spinal Cord Injury Foundation, and he was a key player in getting then-Mayor Richard Lugar to establish the Mayor's Council on the Handicapped. Jim was wheelchair-bound, but he was not himself spinal cord injured. But he advocated on their behalf tirelessly. One of the things he used to say when speaking publicly about the spinal cord injured was, "You never know when someday you're going to end up in a wheelchair yourself." Now that particular statement was one thing that I did not like about Jim's approach for many years. I thought he was trying to make people feel guilty for their good health, and part of that guilt then leads over into pity for the disabled. I didn't want to be an object of pity. I just wanted people to care about the fact that I and people like me had certain needs, like curb cuts and ramps and elevators and stuff, that are necessary for us to get around in the world. But Jim pointed out to me that my disability is one that I've had my whole life, and so I didn't really appreciate the experiences of a spinal cord injury person who probably spent much of their life with normal physical ability and then suddenly found themselves paralyzed and in a wheelchair. It wasn't until after I finished college and I'd been working as a computer programmer for almost 2 years when my own disability took a turn for the worst. My heart and lungs started failing, and even though I recovered somewhat, I lost a lot of stamina and strength, along with the ability to work a full-time job. I couldn't do things that I used to be able to do myself. I had to quit work and learn to do things all over again. I used to have a little use of my arms, but I lost what little use I had. It was no longer safe for me to ride around my neighborhood alone, because if my wheelchair hit a little bump in the pavement, it could knock my hand off the driving control, and I'd be stuck. At first it was a really depressing time for me to lose any ability, because I didn't have that much ability to begin with. I'd sit there and say to myself, "Where's that well-adjusted handicapped person I used to know named Chris Young?" Well, the answer was he went away when I lost that little ability that I had. Eventually I began to realize the wisdom behind my friend Jim, who had passed away by this time. My corollary to his statement is, you never know when someday you're going to become more disabled than you already are. Jim was right. I wasn't ready. I didn't really understand what the other people had been going through. I was, in some ways, insensitive to what they had experienced by losing their ability, where I had been disabled my whole life. Now, today's first reading speaks to us about how we treat foreigners, and it begins by reminding the reader that they too were once an alien in the land where they live. That reminded me of Jim because in some ways it's saying be careful how you treat the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and the foreigner, because you either have been or someday could be in their shoes. The rest of the readings are all on the same topic, about how we treat our neighbors. And it concludes with Jesus summarizing the 10 Commandments in those 2 great commandments: to love your God with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole soul. And the second one is as important, to love your neighbor as yourself. This is one of several places in Scripture where we find a form of the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do to you. Love your neighbor as yourself, in effect. In these tough economic times, people who thought they had good jobs and were living in a nice home and felt safe and secure have suddenly found themselves chronically unemployed, losing their home and possessions, and nowhere to turn except for their neighbors. Those who advocate that the fortunate need to help the less fortunate, they've been accused of socialism and class warfare. But helping those who are in need and treating them as your neighbor, treating them as you would want to be treated if you were in their situation, that's not socialism. That's not class warfare. That's Christianity. And remember, you may never know when someday you're going to be the one who's turning to your neighbor for help. Let's hope that they respond and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's Good News on Tap for the 30th Sunday of Ordinary Time.